something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to American Exception. I'm Aaron Good. Today's episode is free for everyone thanks to our American Exception podcast subscribers. If you want access to all of the American Exception podcast episodes so you can better understand the deep politics and history of the U.S. empire, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/AmericanException. Either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Omar Zahzah, it's great to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure, and you have written an important and timely new book called Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestine Liberation Struggle. And I think that there's a lot in the title that kind of would give you a hint of what this is about, Zionism and the control of tech platforms of Silicon Valley and all that. Can you just tell us the thesis of your book and why you chose to write it? Although I think we could probably guess the reasons why. I'd like to hear you explain it.
Sure. Well, to put it in a nutshell, I mean, the thesis of the book is basically how the platforms that initially, however unwittingly, helped advance the Palestinian narrative, in contrast to the censorship of corporate legacy media, ended up becoming the new censors essentially in their own right and replicating the same forms. Well, ended up replicating censorship. We can go into their particular forms of censorship, but basically how the thing that starts out as the solution becomes the new problem and starts to collaborate with the old problem, if you will.
Right, because the interactions online, I mean, this is a very strange time, in that the people that advocate now for Israel or Palestine are not really received well, but there's so much, you sense that there's a lot of suppression on there if you do post about these things, because you know that's how the platforms work. I mean, I've had things that were just outright censored before for no legitimate reason whatsoever, and the level of manipulation on these platforms would seem to be off the charts, and yet difficult to ever quantify or really put your finger on. So their book covers a lot of different aspects of this, from the more disturbing things like the kill lists and using AI to basically make sort of eliminationist genocidal statecraft like automated, like top to bottom, which is really disturbing, and then down to the more mundane, tedious, trifling crap, like having all these spammers online and fake personas and everything else to manipulate what is really happening on the internet and how popular or unpopular certain things are. Let's talk about the kill lists and Lavender. Talk about that for a bit. How the Israelis have tried to use this technology to kill people, which killing people seems to be one of their favorite things to do. It seems to be their way to solve every problem. Let's talk about how they've tried to bring AI into this.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, because I think it really is a demonstration of some of the most insidious applications of this emergent technology that is really being shoved down our throats. I don't think we can really, even like those of us removed, at least in the immediate sense, from the Palestinian question, still can't escape this broader question of AI. So with the the genocide in Gaza, with the Palestinian struggle more broadly, I think right now we're seeing some of the most dire manifestations of of basically the consequences of this technology being applied in an unfettered context to the most brutal applications of power. I mean, so Lavender, the Gospel, they refer to these AI-generated target lists that, help the Israeli occupation forces basically automatically generate lists of Palestinians, individual Palestinians to target and kill, as well as lists of infrastructure to target, which can include, private residences. And so, right from when they were exposed by 972 Mag, I believe in collaboration with the local caller, right? There had been widespread outcry about these platforms because although they tout themselves, as these types of mechanisms often do, on being very efficient, on being very thorough, they actually have a large margin of error, which of course has fatal results. And then, I mean, that's not even getting into the question of, resistance versus a colonial military occupation. But even for the terms that you state, this thing is just unquestionably lethal. And yet, there's this widespread impunity that Israel is practicing in order to wield this technology, and at the same time, touting the efficiency of the technology and helping it target and destroy more and more and more, right? So essentially what these do, your listeners may be familiar with this, but I'll just give a brief rehash, right, is that these are lists that help automatically generate targets. So the point of them is that the military doesn't have to do the thinking, the intelligence to do them themselves. Now, of course, they're generated by intelligence that is fed into them. And yet, nevertheless, you're getting an almost immediate and collective itemization of people and of places to target. And I think we don't need to look much further than what we've been seeing in our feeds, some of the most sensational depictions and even legacy corporate media images to see the widespread devastation that this has unleashed in Gaza. So essentially automated kill lists and bombing lists to make the job of killing that much easier, that much more efficient, and to put it, I guess, into the kind of updated slick language of the corporate technocracy.
Yes, and when you look at what they've done to Gaza, it doesn't seem as though there is some sort of discerning, supercomputer brain figuring out what to destroy, because they seem to destroy everything. I mean, they seem to have made the whole area look like Hiroshima.
Right, and they'll say that themselves. I mean, that's also part of their propaganda, which is what makes the whole thing so contradictory, right? They'll literally have said things like, well, we're targeting, when we target this hospital, we're targeting Hamas. When we target this school, we're targeting Hamas. I mean, they'll say that, and yet at the same time turn right around and say we have this highly efficient technology that is basically just, resulting in mass murder and mass devastation.
Yes, I haven't seen anything like it in my lifetime, anything so brazen as what we've witnessed here in the last couple of years. And it's been a clarifying moment, I think, for many people because, I wrote my political science dissertation on the American, the deep state, the regime, the empire, the apex of the, foreign policy establishment, whatever you want to call it, like that sort of top-down power that dominates the U.S. regime, and I was kind of agnostic about Israel. I mentioned that that oftentimes the U.S. has farmed things out to satellite client, state intelligence agencies, but that I'm not sure Israel really fits into that category, and it's hard to really establish a clean patron-client relationship between the two because of the presence of so many Zionists among the U.S. oligarchy. And so it's been difficult to try to put that, try to say how much of this is just the U.S. empire and how much of it is this unique, very powerful constituency within the oligarchy that determines U.S. foreign policy. But I think now you see so much more evidence of the state being steered directly by or manipulated by people who are partisans of Zionism to the detriment of U.S. actual foreign policy and maintaining U.S. hegemony, even maintaining U.S. imperialism. They seem to be suffering a lot or damaging the cause of U.S. hegemony by backing Israel because of the brutality of it all. And this is starting to get to be perceived by more people, and the Zionists themselves are not helping themselves. Do you recall the Norm Coleman? We can talk about the social media aspects here, because this is sort of the other side of the coin with the AI kill bots and these sort of things that are just designed to murder you. Well, they also want to manipulate your mind, and you can take that from Norm Coleman. I mean, you recall what he said about he said something like, we're the masters of the universe. Jews own all the social media. We're the masters of the universe. I'm paraphrasing, but that's not that far from what he said. What did you think, after knowing that you'd just written a book on this subject, what did you think when you heard Norm Coleman saying these things?
Well, I mean, I think in general, there's been, I think within political Zionism, I feel like particularly in this moment where there is this insistence on continuing to explicitly entrench the media hegemony, the political messaging, and the unfiltered military support for Zionism in Israel, that's basically the context within which I took it. I mean, I think that right now, because of the kind of broader mask-off moment that the genocide has given us, maybe we're seeing a little bit more of kind of an emboldened stance. But I think it's always been clear to supporters of Palestine that hegemony of all sorts has always been the ultimate goal, because it is hegemony that essentially enables the continued violence and devastation in Palestine, right? I mean, it was the media hegemony before, especially the corporate legacy media, right, that really enabled the manufacture of consent. Now, I think it's interesting. Maybe I'll just like bracket this for a second. We can get into it a little bit maybe in the next few minutes. But I also think when we talk about manufacturing consent, sometimes there's an interesting dynamic whereby the messaging that we're seeing that is intended to manufacture the consent may not necessarily be as comprehensively operational as we sometimes assume it is to be when we look at the model, which is to say that sometimes I think there's actually a little bit more room for difference and distinction in individual public opinion. But nevertheless, I think we've seen this idea that the media needs to work a certain way. The military-industrial complex, of course, committed Zionists want it first and foremost to be working in the service of Israel, whatever Israel does. And I do think there's been, in general, a really disastrous political decision, especially within maybe the past decade and a half, past 2 decades, that we're sort of, gung-ho going all in for this project. And I think that what we're seeing now is, as the public image becomes increasingly difficult to completely control, we're getting a lot more blowback, because there's an increasing public awareness of how the Israeli project is not this precise, unfiltered, unquestionably superior, project that it bills itself to be, right? It's not this ethical, humane, democratic, so on and so forth, ultimate ideal of political exceptionalism, that needs to be supported in order to kind of guide the way for the other, would-be imperialist states to follow. That's kind of the sort of writing, the implicit message that a lot of the political leaders had been following, particularly the U.S., that, was in many ways the most invested, because its partnership had been basically banked on this premise of, we're going to be your proxy into the region. And I think a lot of people wanted that, and supported Israel even at times against the kind of immediate, apparent short-term, disadvantage that relationship posed. But I think now the contradictions are in such full view that it's basically untenable on multiple fronts, and that untenability is apparent to so many people. Nevertheless, I think because that's happening, you need to rely on the other mechanisms of control and consent even more. And so when you have people say things like, well, we control this, part of it, I think, is also this aspirational quality of we need to remain dominant, and we need these platforms to continue to do what they are supposed to do for this political project, which is to make sure that people support this project no matter what, and that we continue to cleanse or excise them of any oppositional messaging. So I tend to take statements like that, not just in the immediate context, but also like what do they kind of betoken a little bit more broadly in terms of the moment that we're in and how these things have always been intended to function to these officials. But of course, we're seeing an increasing consolidation. I think what to me, I don't know how you feel about this, it almost seems like we're entering a slightly different paradigm in this moment where the consolidation is becoming so complete or could potentially be so complete, which I think is relatively new, where the owners of social media are the main owners of corporate legacy media in a very particular way at a moment where we have the increasing ascendancy or, presumed ascendancy of AI, people who've had ties to the security state, so on and so forth, where even as I think we've had things like, Herman M. Chomsky's notion of manufacturing consent, we've always had this kind of corporate oligarchy that was directly in tandem with U.S. imperialism. I think we're seeing some things escalate rapidly and so blatantly and so directly in directions that even as I think a lot of what I was talking about in the book are the direct outgrowth of a corporate and political kind of consolidation, I believe that consolidation is happening a little bit more rapidly than, at least in terms of the forms it's taking, than I had necessarily even expected by the time I finished working on it.
Yeah, on the one hand, you're right that it seems like the noose is kind of tightening in terms of, totalitarian management of the of civil society, what passes for civil society these days, because obviously you don't have any kind of real ideological diversity in the media that has money behind it these days. Unless it's, in kind of, it's the illusion. You do have some illusion of diversity, but honestly, I feel like a lot of the so-called left outlets of the institutional left is so bad about all of these issues anyway that, it makes me, as someone who studies the clandestine state, think that a lot of these outlets are functionally, plants of some kind. I don't like, the Nation is so bad on so many issues. For example, it's like when you think of what the left, if you think that you live in a society where there has to be the illusion of democracy and open debate, well, then there's going to have to be something resembling like a left that says like they would like a more just, less militaristic, political order and so on. And then, but the punches that get pulled by like the Nation or Democracy Now, for example, are so glaring, that and it's been that way for a long time. That this is. So it's more obviously totalitarian now, but it's been that way for kind of a while, just in a weird American version where there's an illusion of pluralism, and that's actually part of the totalitarian control, that like ultimately there really is no institutional support for people who really are opposed to lawless imperial capitalism. So how much do you think that this moment represents a qualitative versus quantitative change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would have to say that perhaps it's more quantitative in the sense that, maybe there's a part of me that just wanted to be proven wrong to a certain extent, if that makes sense, or to hope that something could sort of, if not break through, at least we could see something a little bit less expected happening. Maybe that's the way to put it. Because I have always felt that when push comes to shove, the cultural apparatuses, are going to continue to capitulate to the direction of imperialism. And of course, including the biggest economic forces that subtend that process. So, I think it's good for some semblance of whatever we might call democracy that the media continues to fold in these ways? No. But at the same time, I think it's true that we shouldn't necessarily pretend that what we've had materially and economically for all of these years is something that substantively, as opposed to strategically, presents itself a certain way. But I mean, even with the veneer itself falling, that could still be a development in its own right, because it still does leave the question of what's going to happen now, right? If we're being very clearly shown. And of course, some could push back and say, like, well, that veneer fell many times for many other people. But regardless, I think in the current configuration of power and interests that we are now, I think we're seeing an important, erosion of that. So where does that leave us, and what's going to happen next? I think that's the important question to think through.
Right, and I think we'll return to this, but but before we get back to these sort of bigger, before we get to these questions, is kind of the bigger directions of where this is going. Maybe we could talk about some of the things that the big tech tools that they do use to silence and manipulate discourse across the internet. So you talk about a number of these things, and we're mostly familiar with them if we're on the internet and we're interested in these. In the issues of manipulation of tech platforms, social media, and all this. So maybe you could talk about the things like shadow banning and blacklisting people, and paid phony trolls, and astroturfing organizations, and all of this, and how these things create a sort of fake social media ecosystem that is basically totally ethereal, but yet it makes impressions in people's minds.
Yeah, definitely. And, I'll start that, I think, by responding to an earlier question of yours that I think I kind of forgot to come back to, but that question of, why did you...
I throw a lot out there, so that's not probably my fault.
Well, one of the things you'd asked is what led you to write the book? And, part of that reason, in addition to just being somebody who was interested in watching a lot of these developments unfold culturally, I'm somebody who's also been an organizer for Palestine for many years. And so I experienced a lot of the things that I write about directly. So one of those things was the digital blacklisting and the doxing, right? So in one of my chapters, I talk about finding out that I'd been added to Canary Mission, which I think most people are familiar with at this point. But, just in case, I'll give a quick recap. It's this essentially anonymously run, Zionist website that demonizes people who do organizing and activism for Palestine. Makes the usual false conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Talks about people as being quote unquote terrorists or terrorist supporters. And it at least in the earliest iterations, it basically made its purpose explicitly clear, which is to make sure that people cannot find employment for their activism and for their views, right? It had this tagline of make sure today's radicals don't become tomorrow's employees, right? So blacklisting, and then of course there's been other sites since Canary Mission that have kind of followed in the wake. I talk about stopantisemitism.org, and there's other ones, because what you realize is, even though there's some examples that kind of establish the mold and they're a little bit more known, ultimately we're not just looking at one site, we're looking at a template that can be continuously readopted, and kind of reconfigured. So even the language that Canary Mission uses is often going to be kind of copy pasted and used in other seemingly more organic kind of attempts to blacklist people or to demonize people. I wrote about instances where at one point, I believe it was in Westwood in California. There, several years ago, there had been a screening, or people had tried to put on a screening of the film 1948, Creation or Catastrophe. And part of the opposition to that film, was led by a series of Zionists and Zionist organizations. But when you looked at some of what had been presented as an independent comment opposing the film, you realize this is actually just copy pasted from the Canary Mission profile. So it's also supposed to be kind of like a ready-made template that people can use to kind of continue to spread these defamation, of other people. But what I think is also interesting is that this operates on so many levels, right? So you have the blacklisting and the digital doxing of individual organizers and activists. But I was also looking at how big tech platforms themselves often normalize this kind of anti-Palestinian climate in their spaces, and how they hew increasingly, if they weren't already there, towards total capitulation to Israel and the Zionist project, essentially by expunging their platforms of Palestinian content and expression as much as possible. So basically, I was looking at how do digital spaces become extensions of physical processes of colonization and erasure. I basically reappropriated the term digital settler colonialism to refer to that, and really place big emphasis on how the choices that big tech platforms make in terms of their content moderation is a realization of this broader capitulation to colonialism, facilitated, also under the dictates of imperialism, because essentially, the imperialist project had basically made support for Israel and Zionism a kind of common sense that most companies are interested in pursuing at this point in pursuit of their own bottom line. But so blacklisting, doxing, ways that individual organizers and activists can be, have their livelihoods destroyed, can, be intimidated to get them to stop doing this type of organizing. I'd also talked about astroturfing, as you mentioned, which is basically when sites will present themselves as being independent, or organic, but then all of a sudden will, at strategic moments, start to present, kind of Zionist or pro-Israel messaging, right? And Ali Abunema had talked about this. What's happening is that, especially in the wake of things like, it seems kind of strange at this moment to talk about preceding moments of Israeli assaults just because we've just gone through 2 years of genocide, right? But like even way back to 2014, looking at something like Operation Protective Edge, anytime there are these mass bombing campaigns, you start to get more and more outrage. And so, Israel on its face immediately becomes a little bit less saleable as a product, particularly to online audiences. And so what people will do is they'll make these sites that present themselves as being dedicated to something else, right? Some other cause or interest. And then once in a while, they'll slip in some pro-Israel messaging here and there as a way of potentially trying to sway their audience.
I've seen these accounts even on besides like actual websites. Like I see all kinds of accounts on Twitter that seem to be not real accounts of somebody who's like, Knicks fan or something like that. And then he posts about basketball, just inane, whatever about basketball, but then, have a bunch of posts randomly about like, Hasbro bullshit, and it's like, these are not, like, these are all anonymous, and it's just, there's all the anonymous people that just show up, and if you look at their profiles, there's not a ton of activity, but then a good bit of it is just like random, responding to things related to like Zionism, especially. That's like seems to be the thing that has the most of these dubious accounts behind it. I think more than even, I know for other things like Ukraine war and all of this, you had like NAFO and all of that, but that was some more obvious and in your face. With Zionism, there are just these accounts that seem to be totally fake, and probably some person who has 10 accounts and just that's their job or something, is how it seems. How much of that do you think is going on, and is there any way to even be able to quantify it ballpark wise?
Well, there's definitely a lot of it going on, and but even the Israeli government doesn't make too much of a secret about this, at least if you look at the funding that they're directing towards online advocacy. I think recently you had Benjamin Netanyahu talking about the importance of online influencers, right? We've had the, what's happening with TikTok, and we've had an increasing attempt, basically the installation of this figure who was affiliated with the Israeli military, now basically going to be also one of the censors of TikTok. We've had all of this money, just I believe in 2024, poured into what the digital diaspora or propaganda, and so it's very clearly an Israeli government venture to continue to pour money into these things. So it's clear that there is, from the very highest level, there is this directive to continue to be as active as possible on online spaces, on digital spaces, to try to quell the rising narrative tide of support for Palestine, for sure. The trickiness is, sometimes when they present themselves as being something that they're not, it may take a minute or so to figure it out, but there's no doubt that there is a large presence and an increasing presence if we look at the support that continues to be poured into it. And I think a lot of it is that, what we've seen going on, in terms of the ongoing assaults for years and years, with the increasing refinement, I guess, of the internet, the emergence of newer platforms, there start to be more, at least theoretically, right? There start to be more opportunities for people to kind of speak back. And, part of what I did in the book is I traced, several years of examples of individuals, including Palestinians, who had done just that, right? How they're taking to platforms like, Twitter, as it was known at the time, to spread information about bombing campaigns that otherwise were not in Gaza, that otherwise were not being covered, by different forms of media, and how that was largely effective. But then over time, what happens when these spaces become increasingly savvy about how Palestinians are strategically utilizing their platforms, right? And then they start to kind of roll back or try to roll back some of the narrative gains that have been made for Palestine, right? So all of this is kind of a roundabout way of saying that in answer to your question, I'm looking at several modes of how the internet or digital spaces can function in a colonial sense. One is the individual ways in which Zionists, including the Israeli government, will directly try to commandeer digital spaces. And the second is the extent to which big tech companies themselves increasingly willingly facilitate what they know to be the broader will of the Zionist project by engaging in anti-Palestinian content moderation and censorship.
Yes, and despite all of this, we have the fact that the American public is more sympathetic at this point to the Palestinians than to the Israelis, by and large. I mean, I think that's what recent polls have shown, that there was at the beginning of, post October 7, there was a very large gap in favor of support for Israel, but now I believe that the American public is more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. I think that's what some of the recent polls have suggested by a small margin, but it's that's really notable in spite of all of this manipulation. So, I mean, by and large, Zionists dominate Congress, the electoral system in the United States. There's a tiny number of people, even though most of the country is more, this shows how anti-democratic it is, and really how fascistic it is when it's a clearly fascistic, not even just fascistic project in the Middle East, but essentially a Nazified, like Nazi blood and soil fascism, not even like the corporate fascism that we could say has kind of prevailed in the U.S. since World War II in a sort of covert way, or the Mussolini fascism, but this is just straight up the worst, kind of fascism, like a extermination of Untermenschen for Lebensraum on behalf of the master race. I mean, that fits what we're seeing to a T. And so, how much of this? What do you make of the fact that there's still enough space and still enough room for the truth to somehow emerge, that you've seen this big shift in public opinion? I mean, does this show the limits of this, or does this mean that we should really brace for like a terrible counterattack, or both?
Well, I think it's both to a certain extent, because I think even, what we were talking about a little while ago in terms of the increasing consolidation of, all forms of media, like, things like what we're seeing, with the new arrangements for TikTok, for example, under what had been this ongoing ban. Like, what are you going to see now? Larry Ellison is one of the main figures involved. David Ellison, his son, who's bought out, right? CBS essentially done this giant merger. They have Barry Weiss, as the editor-in-chief, right? These things are definitely going to continue, because I think there's an awareness of just how much is possible when you still have some kind of a counter space, however imperfect it is, right? I mean, again, big tech was never anti-Zionist. It's just that some of these platforms were, I think, reappropriated in really exceptional and creative ways by Palestinians and their supporters, and that allowed for enough to get through that could sway people. Um, you know, I think what's going to happen is they're going to continue to try to stamp that out in whatever insidious oligarchic way they can use. And now, because we have this current regime that I think can be much more direct about things, the mechanisms for doing that are going to look very crude, and they're going to look like throwback to the 19th century kind of forms of repression and just forms of complete anti-democratic just capitalism in all of its bloodiest forms. I think we're going to see a lot more things like that. And so I think the fact that this control doesn't necessarily equal, a total capture of public hearts and minds, it's important. And it means that I think we just need to continue to find innovative and creative ways to resist, even as they're giving us increasingly less legitimized spaces to do that, right? I don't quite know what that's going to look like, but I definitely think that now more than ever, it's important to continue kind of holding the front of these ongoing anti-imperial critiques, holding them, forward and not backing down, even as the legitimization continues to shrink. But I definitely think we're going to see increasing attempts to, empty out spaces of any of their potential for holding a thought that's kind of, contrary to the status quo.
Yes, and you brought up Barry Weiss, and I mean, this to me seems a really important case to look at if you're confused at all about how this whole thing works, because she came out as some sort of anti or critic of wokeism in a certain way, and left a job somewhere. Was it the Times or the Post? I have to admit, I don't follow these kind of public. My take on corporate media is sort of ossified in a way because I just can't watch it very much anymore, or read it. But I remember that she left a job and she was sort of an anti-woke person, and then she set up this free press thing outlet. And it just got bought out for I think it was Ellison himself who gave her, what was it, $100 million, or who? How did that work? That sale work? I mean, just talk us through this, because it seems like the outlet that she created she got $100 million or $150 million for it, and there's no way, in my estimation, I mean, I could be wrong, that it was really bringing in that kind of revenue in any kind of organic way. Like, it shouldn't really have been. I don't even know that they would have enough to even. Given how difficult it is to operate in this space and have any kind of support to hire a staff and so on, I would really wonder if they were ever even able to cover their operating expenses with the revenue they brought in. And yet she just sold this for $100 million or $150 million and is now going to be running CBS essentially, or having a huge role there. So talk about this and how brazen it is.
Yeah. So I believe the amount was $150 million for Weiss's publication, the Free Press, right? This digital publication that was essentially this venture capitalist-backed right-wing, very right-wing platform. And yeah, exactly as you're saying, Weiss became kind of a favorite of the right, especially of this current regime, for her quote-unquote anti-wokeism, right? And including her pro-Israel views, right? Which, she's had for many, many years, and which essentially helped define her from when she was at Columbia University, which she is an alum of, which is interesting because, part of what really helped her publication to rise to the heights, if you want to call it that it did, was that it basically had been handpicked to be the publication, or what, which was one of the main instruments of the administration's war on universities, right? So there had been some leaks, about the Colombia administration's responses to, the Trump administration's ultimatums that essentially helped the project of continuing to, take away the sovereignty of that university more and more, helped that project along. And, Weiss herself has been appointed as the editor-in-chief of CBS, and this was made possible through a merger of David Ellison, with his Skydance Media, merging basically with the holder of CBS. And Ellison, of course, is the son of Larry Ellison, who's the co-founder of Oracle, the data company, and the tech giant, who is one of the main people who's going to be involved in the new ownership of TikTok, right? Which was one of the main apps that, we should say that, an app that had this moral panic whipped up about it, that it was changing people's minds about Israel, right? Because, during the genocide, it had been, in many ways, reputed to be the preferred app among younger people. And so, they'd been trying to ban this, going back to 2020, around these kind of claims about, China is going to steal our data, as though there isn't data mining and surveillance that we're doing willingly, for users of, U.S. platforms. But in any case, that campaign didn't really gain traction until people really started, complaining about what it was doing in terms of advancing Palestine messaging, right? And this went all the way to Greenblatt of the ADL saying, we have a TikTok problem, a Gen Z problem. And from there, you start to see this really bipartisan effort take shape even more, right? And eventually realize the legislation that would force ByteDance, the parent company, to sell TikTok. We're kind of seeing the gains of that now, right? It started under Biden. It was postponed several points under Trump. And now we're seeing basically this project that is going to give it new ownership, which includes Larry Ellison. Now, I said all that as background just to say that, although David Ellison is Larry Ellison's son, so now essentially we are seeing the consolidation of online and legacy corporate media in ways that, are kind of a starker example of some of the patterns that had been set in place before, right? So the capture is a little bit more total. Even as before you'd had kind of a lot of the same overlapping interests, you'd had capitulation ultimately to the same broader institutions. Right now, we're looking at a moment where there's going to be more means of even more direct censorship, especially around the question of Palestine, because if you look at reporting in outlets like Mint Press, right, it's made very clear that it's, Weiss's anti-wokeism as well as her views on Israel that had really made her a favorite as a contender for the role. And I believe it had been stipulated that it is going to be her perspective, her editorial perspective, on particular salient issues, including the quote-unquote Middle East that is being sought in this moment. So we're definitely going to be seeing a lot more attempted censorship. What that's exactly going to play out and look like remains to be seen, but I think it's pretty obvious that that's the goal here.
Right. I mean, it's so obvious that Weiss's main qualification is just, unwavering devotion to Zionism, no matter how many, babies it kills or, hospitals it levels or journalists it murders, etc. And to me, the fear, the paranoia of the Zionists over the shifting tide of public opinion is the fact that it would motivate them to purchase these outlets and be so nakedly just using money to control what people think. I mean, it was interesting that in the discussions over Charlie Kirk and his assassination, which Bibi, quickly came out and denied, which is a very normal thing to do whenever someone gets shot halfway across the world, to come and really protest very much that you had nothing to do with it. But in the context of what he was saying, as we're starting to learn, he said that, these donors, they're pulling their money if I'm not going to stick to the pro-Israel line and ban anti-Zionist speakers. from speaking, and he says something. There's some message or comment that he made of like they're adhering to all the stereotypes, right? And this would seem to be like, it seems like they're sort of playing with fire in a way, because it's so brazen what they are doing now. And I think that they maybe have relied in the past on being able to do these sorts of things by being able to say, oh, come on, you're going to say that we're just a bunch of Jews using our money to control everybody. You're an anti-Semite, right? But we were talking about Zionism, a particularly insane political project, not a religion, and it really does entail billionaire oligarchs looking around at any media outlet they don't control and then just buying it with seemingly endless supplies of cash that they have on hand. Is this going to do more harm than good, or not? I mean, you don't have a crystal ball any more than I do, but I tend to think it could fuel a backlash as people realize, like, where do I even go to not be inundated? Because especially the younger generation, they've already kind of been woken up to this and to the sort of mind control aspects of the whole project. I mean, do they think, are the younger generations really that stupid that they will not notice that, like, every platform is just, they get the same propaganda for, mass murder and expropriation on every platform? Or is this going to work? I know you can't say, but like, what do you think was the more likely? What are the risks of their strategy?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's going to work. I mean, I think, the younger generations are definitely much more intelligent than I think, all of those in power would like to give them credit for. They're not just this, captive, unthinking audience, right? And, even I think the charge of being chronically online for them may be a little bit of a stereotype, but I think that the grain of truth to it, at least that I've seen and experienced, is precisely the fact that they know that so much other media is compromised, that they go to where they can to find things that will at least give them a differing perspective in a lot of cases, right? So I don't think trying to control things just in this top-down way is actually going to make people think differently. If anything, it'll probably just confirm the assumptions that they've already had about other forms of media, not being as useful to them. And I think that, what a lot of people say is that, when everything is so compromised, what do? You have to turn to something else or create something else. I don't know if people are going to turn to those solutions. It's probably the time to start thinking about it if that isn't already underway. But yeah, I think it's just mostly going to, result in people kind of being turned off and turning away, and we'll see whatever forms that takes. I mean, I think I want to go back to your point about anti-Semitism. I mean, I think one of the things that's so especially stark in this moment is just how that phrase has been weaponized by, Zionists and
it's nonsensical. Right. It is totally nonsensical. What is a Semite? It's not Milikowski whose family's from Poland, some white guy who shows up on the Levant and says, "This is my place," like.
Yeah, and
I mean, it makes no goddamn sense at all.
I mean, we're seeing
they're using this term to say, "Don't be bigoted against Semites," apparently, but it's really these Europeans who are slaughtering Semites.
Yeah,
and it is just infuriating.
I mean, I think there's also just something to be said for every single mobilization that we're seeing, among Zionist institutions and individuals, really has been just to weaponize the term to condemn people who are speaking out against the genocide, right? It's, I mean, all the way up, from the ADL to Israeli officials, what we're seeing is this condemnation of people who are speaking out for Palestinian rights, in favor of Palestinian freedom and an end to genocide, right? And that is where the term gets weaponized, right? They are anti-Semites for doing these things. I think for a lot of people, that's really revealing kind of the hollowness of that charge and showing just how cynical of a strategy is really being levied against them. So I think, this strategy, I think it's always been insidious because it basically weaponized the language and the rhetoric of anti-racism to demonize people who are speaking out against racism as being racist themselves. I always thought that there was such an insidiousness to it. We've never seen, you know, I don't think we've ever seen a genocide in history where it was done to this extent and in this way, right? And to think about the fact that this is, ultimately in many ways invoking the legacy of the Holocaust to justify another genocide, another Holocaust in this moment is just, I mean, again, I can't even really grapple with just the insidiousness of those contradictions. But nevertheless, I just think that it's on such full display now for people. And so I think that this goes back to, what anti-Zionist Jewish critiques of Zionism, the importance of those, right? The idea that Zionism has always thrived on anti-Semitism, as kind of a strategic weapon, but also at the same time, because Zionism is not really a project that is dedicated to keeping Jews safe or anybody safe, because look at the type of world that it stokes and that it needs to maintain. It's this perpetual violence and paranoia, right? Basically, its ultimate implications are some people are less deserving of rights, and you need to trust us on that, right? It's not the ethos for any kind of a just world. So I do think the unexpected blowback that they're facing is that more and more people are just waking up to the idea that there's nothing exceptional about Palestine and there's nothing exceptional about Israel, right? It's an ethno-state. It's a fascist colonial ethno-state, just like any other ethno-state throughout history. What it's doing is not unique. It's actually very, very familiar, but they now have the license to actually trust their own eyes and to trust their own instincts, whereas the purpose of things like the ADL or things like all of these different government positions that Israel creates as to serve as cultural mediators is to get people to distrust their own instincts. Now they're saying, no, we can't trust our instincts. There's nothing that is beneficial about Zionism. In fact, it's a violent and dangerous project, and it needs to be opposed.
Right. Yeah, and in sociological terms, it makes no sense, really, because, we're taught pretty early in Sociology 101 that the definition of racism is prejudice plus power, right? It's not merely being prejudiced against someone, it's power. And really, when you're talking about the creation of the State of Israel, the goal was to really deracinate the Jews, right? Because they were a racialized other. So really, when they say anti-Semitism, it's really saying anti-Jewish racism would be a more reasonable way to describe the term. I don't know why they choose the nonsensical, misleading term to describe it, but I think it's because it has a certain cachet and it sounds totally different from other forms, and so you can't really discuss it in terms of racism. You have to discuss it in terms of some sort of primordial prejudice that you must be aware is very salient, and you must take it very, very seriously. But when you look at the situation in the United States, if you're saying like, okay, anti-Semitism is really just a weird, not bizarre euphemism to describe anti-Jewish racism, so let's actually investigate the extent to which there is racism against Jewish people in the United States. And if you would look at these, it's very easy to understand and quantify the extent to which black people are in the United States are the victims of racism. The prison population, overrepresentation in the prison population among the poorest sectors of the society, household wealth, levels of educational attainment, and so on. This does not remotely apply to the Jewish experience in America. And I'm not saying there are not incidents of racism against Jewish people in the United States, because racism is socially constructed, and it's if you racialize Jewish people and you hate them and you commit some crimes against them or you discriminate against them, in the aggregate, if this was so widespread, you would see evidence of this, as there's so much evidence of racism against black people in the United States as a historical structural thing. It just is overwhelming. You'd be, an idiot to deny it. But the the fact that this group, which is given the sort of, they have more protection against racism in the United States in terms of institutional support and social taboos and so on, and yet they are, if you look at the real incidence of anti-Jewish racism or anything you'd use to measure it, it's the opposite, really. They're not a group that is oppressed or mistreated or marginalized. I mean, at what point are people going to start thinking more logically about this going forward? I mean, I know this is, I just feel that there should be some sort of sea change in the way that we think about these things. And is this recognition kind of in the back of the minds, perhaps, of people like Norm Coleman who say, we're the masters of the universe, okay? I mean, you never heard slaves saying, we're the masters of the universe, or whatever, people in the Jim Crow South. I mean, this is so absurd, and can it really continue like this, even if they buy up all the platforms?
Well, I think I think what you're getting at is the issues of how, again, to kind of come back to this point about what is and is not anti-Semitism, right? Part of the issue, I think, is that we have this very concerted effort to define anti-Semitism as, essentially support for Palestine, and in this moment, opposition to genocide. And I mean, even at the statistical level, right? This is precisely the issue with the, so-called research done by organizations like the ADL, which will often conflate, pro-Palestine or things supportive of BDS as, examples of anti-Semitism. And of course, when you do that, it just leads to this astronomical number, because, I mean, you're just talking about...
right. They'll say, like, it's 75% growth in anti-Semitism, and they're like, what?
Right.
Okay, let's look at these.
And the irony is that if you actually look at the Zionist project and the supporters of the Zionist project, I mean, I don't want to deny that there is anti-Semitism, because there is. We've seen, hate crimes. We've seen, but at the same time, like, look at the political bedfellows of the Zionist project are basically including the alt-right. They're including, people who would be most likely to have these anti-Semitic views, actual anti-Semitic views in the first place. And yet, many times what's happening is you're throwing in your lot with those individuals to support this project of a racist ethno-state, right? And you want to redefine time and time again opposition to that ethno-state as racism, as anti-Semitism. So I do think that what's happening is that there's a willful disavowal of a lot of the apparent in the sense of very visible contradictions that are at play, right? I think, again, the cynicism of that project, of that weaponization of anti-Semitism, is on increasingly full display, and I do think more people are conscious of it now. And so we'll see, if that leads to, increasing backlash, though I think it already has been. But just what that is going to entail in terms of the decisions of, those in power, I think is going to be interesting to follow, to say the least.
Yeah, and it is I had an interesting experience, because I'm from the Midwest, and I knew a handful of Jewish people growing up, but it really, in terms of what I knew about Judaism, I mean, I knew that there's like the Old Testament and then there's a New Testament and so on, and that the Holocaust was this really horrible thing, and that you shouldn't really, think, you shouldn't ever believe in Nazi ideology, that Jews are the problems of the world, and it was just sort of absurd and kind of cartoonishly evil what the Nazis did. And then I had the experience of, in 2004, being a low-level campaign or fundraiser, basically, like going door to door and talking to people in the Philly suburbs. So I go to a ton of Jewish neighborhoods, and I say mostly Jewish neighborhoods because they all have like the mezuzah on the door, so if it's like a Jewish household, right? I mean, it's an interesting quirk of how it worked out for me in terms of, I wasn't a social scientist then, but like I thought in these terms back then, which is why I became a social scientist. And the people that I talked to weren't fans of Bush. Most of them didn't like Bush. They didn't like the Iraq War and so on. But you look at it now and you read the Clean Break report. You look at these people like Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith, and their connections to Israel, and I've done more studying on this and talked to insiders about it, that it was essentially, propelled by this greater Israel goal of like massive regime change in the region and the clean break from the peace process and so on. But most of the people that I talked to, who a lot of them were Jewish people, were not on board with that at all. They didn't like Bush. They didn't like the war. It wasn't as though they were all reading from this sort of Paul Wolfowitz, Bibi Netanyahu playbook. It really wasn't like that. And so it really is this sort of fringe that of very powerful Zionists that are not even that, they're not so well connected to the mainstream of American, Jewish thinking, I think, if you can say what that is, even though the main organizations, as I understand it, have not really, there's very few, if any, major Jewish organizations or congregations that have come out against what's happening now. So how should we think about the reality of what all of this means for Jewish people in America and a place where there isn't bigotry against groups like, and specifically Jewish people in this case? I mean, how do we reconcile the rank and file feelings of Jewish individuals with this sort of organized political power that is basically fascistic and kind of impossible to defend?
Well, I mean, that's definitely a broad question, and I don't know if it's for me to speak on behalf of Jewish people, but I just, I would come back and say that I think that this really shows the importance of the work that's being done by organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, Anti-Zionist Jewish Network, and, figures like Rabbi Brent Rosen, like people who are basically continuing to lead the charge to say that, we need to continue to reject Zionism, right? And I actually think that, to that question earlier, what moment what's going to happen? What moment are we in? What are people going to do when they realize that the writing is on the wall? I think that one of the hopes is that more and more people continue to embrace anti-Zionism, as the necessary prerequisite to really realizing a more just world and social order. So, I mean, I think that really that's the only alternative for everybody at this point. I mean, we've, just seeing what happened in Gaza, I think it's very clear that there is nothing tenable about continuing to support a colonial project. Appearances don't even really matter, but you don't even have the semblance of, keeping up appearances in this case. It just literally is, as violent and fascistic as it seems, even worse than it seems, because we're only getting maybe 10%,
yes.
Right? So, this is the moment, everybody needs to leave Zionism in the dustbin of history, and it needs to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that when you look at the history of Western imperialism and capitalism, really, which has always been imperialistic, because really once you kick the people off the land in England and you turn it into, farms for sheep for a textile industry, which is like the first capitalist enterprise, it fueled the conquest of Ireland and ramped that up, and which was genocidal also. And then of the North America, which was another genocidal, enterprise for business. I mean, the people that came and killed all of the Indians were there. The Virginia Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, they were there looking for ways to make money because there was less land and less opportunity in Europe because overpopulation and warfare, and then capitalism taking all the land and turning it into capital. It fueled imperialism, and it's always been imperialist, and it's always it's been a system of kind of oligarchs of money and property dictating the political regime. And so even though it seems that in the 21st century, Zionist neoconservatism has really been the propelling force that has brought the U.S., Western hegemony close to the end of its lifespan, I think, after centuries. It's ultimately not really an issue of, definitely not an issue of like Jewish people, and definitely not an issue just of Zionists, who are messing up an otherwise good system. It's a system steeped in blood, exploitation. It's founded on exploitation and expropriation often with a sort of racialized pretext or legitimacy for what it was doing. But it's this system of imperial capitalism, and the U.S. seems that it's going to be eclipsed by the rest of the global South, the global majority, led by China, and that they have better institutions for really getting the most out of their population by making sure people have enough housing, education, etc., infrastructure, and so on. And that seems to be a better way to organize society. I mean, I'm not saying there's not capitalist tendencies in China and there's zero exploitation, because you can't really develop a civilization without stratification and some forms of exploitation. But it's exploitation that seems to be for a national project that has internationalist aspirations and actual, content to it. I mean, is the global majority going to win? And is this really a story of a sort of side chapter or a chapter of this story of the global majority, overcoming the West? Because I feel that when you look back at, capitalism, Western imperialism, the last 2 centuries of especially of colonialism, imperialism, and so on, you can't really defend the West. You can't defend this project of the white West. I don't mean white in the ethnic term. I mean just as a political formation. It can't really be defended unless you are just lying all the time. Hence, you have to buy up everything. And it's not just Zionists here. It's every sort of corporate actor in the West who's interested in reproducing this oligarchy. And are we seeing the end of this? And is Gaza going to be remembered as kind of this delegitimizing, crystallizing event in the minds of humanity? Because that's what I hope that this is what happens. But do you share that hope, or do you share that understanding of where the West is going, and that this is just, in some ways, Gaza is Western civilization?
Yeah. I think that's a powerful formation, thinking about, what has happened in Gaza as in many ways the outgrowth of the absolute worst tendencies of the broader quote-unquote Western project, right? Ultimately, it's always going to lead to this, and it has always led to this. But I think now, as part of your question sets up, what we're also seeing is that, there's an increasing political and material strength, to the rest of the world that is, I think, relatively unique to our moment in history. And at the same time, I think a lot of the lies that were sold to keep us on the system are finally ringing more and more hollow, because, we don't have a lot of the material security that you were describing earlier, right? And I think that
freedom,
right? And I think that, coupled with the increasing cynicism and hollowness of the political posturing, that people are becoming more attuned to, that we were talking about earlier, I think that that's really going to result in a lot of indignation. Now, of course, I don't think you should support things or not support things just based on your own self-interest. I'm just saying that I think that all of that together is really going to result in, and has already been resulting in, increasing dissatisfaction, right? And so I do think we're seeing a relatively new political moment where, imperialism is in many ways on the decline, which isn't to say there isn't still the potential for a lot more violence and devastation and control and extraction, right? I mean, I don't think everything has been completely expended, but I definitely think we're seeing a decline. And what comes next, I don't have a crystal ball, as you were saying, so I can't say for sure, but I think that the decline is undeniable at this point. And I think that also gets to one of the many, many problems with the type of thinking that leads people to support things like the Zionist project, or to support things like the various imperial campaigns of conquest that we've seen throughout history, which is that in addition to the grave human toll and the toll, I think, on the broader spirit of humanity that they always inflict, which I think is the priority. But in addition to that, I think there's also always this leveraging of long-term human interest for the short-term gain of the few. And I think we're finally seeing that the check is starting to be cashed, in the sense that eventually these things are going to catch up with you, right? The chickens are going to come home to roost. You can't really expect the rest of the world to just be under your domination, not to develop any capabilities of their own accord, not to finally get enough sufficiency to have a relative autonomy and to start to try to exercise that. We're in a moment where that's finally beginning to take place, and so it's going to be really important to follow what happens next. But I am concerned because I also think that when you start to see the decline, of empire, you see a lot more violence and you see a lot more intransigence. And so I think in many ways things are going to get even more ugly than they've already been for many of us. But I do think the silver lining is that there's at least the potential to finally think about what does a more just and egalitarian order actually look like, and how can we actually start to follow that.
Right. I mean, for me, the future is wide open because I can see all sorts of possibilities, ranging from, on one end, a utopian trending, human civilization that's internationalist and dedicated to the betterment of human welfare, or nuclear doomsday on the other end, which I could see the West and or Israel, the West or Israel specifically sparking. It's anywhere. So that's a pretty big range of where things could go. Your book is, the title of it, I'll read the whole title, Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestine Liberation Struggle. I think it's a very good resource for anyone who's wanting to look at the media, the attempts at media control and leveraging of technology for this sort of fascistic, pretty fascistic, overtly fascistic Zionist cause. So I recommend that people, if they have any interest in this, to get this book because it's a good source. Where can people, where's the best place for people to get your book?
Best place to get my book would be the Project Censored website or the Seven Stories website. It's available on both of those places, and out as of last month.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I'll put a link to the Project Censored one, but because I'm fond of Mickey Huff, he's a good friend.
Shout out Mickey.
So yes, Mickey Huff, great guy. I'm going to try to see him sometime since he is on the West Coast now. That'll make it a little easier. But Omar Zahzah, thank you so much for being here and for your efforts writing this book and working as an educator who's trying to tell the truth in that mode. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
For access to the rest of our vast and growing library, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I also want to express my deep appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers on Patreon. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. American Exception exists thanks to our Patreon subscribers. On YouTube, we will never be viable. You may notice that we have dropped the Devil's Chess Club title from these episodes. After David Talbot had to leave our team due to his second, more debilitating stroke, I kept the Devil's Chess Club name and theme song and intro. I didn't want to close the book on David's partnership with Bryce and me. I had hopes that he would return. David and I had planned to write 2 books together after 2024, one on the ultra-Zionist neocon takeover of U.S. foreign policy, and another on the RFK assassination. It now seems very unlikely that David will return to podcasting or to writing. As such, it didn't make sense to keep using the Devil's Chess Club brand. Still, to pay homage to David and the outstanding books that David wrote with his wonderful research assistant, Karen Croft, we're going to keep using the Devil's Chess Club theme song intro for our video episodes. David, if you're listening, know that we miss you very much. Finally, and again, please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe so that American Exception can continue to mind the darkness.